I was one of those unusual kids in the 1990s who was not pre-med or pre-engineering. I was pre-law, but even before I was going to pursue law school, I had a deep and abiding interest in religion and specifically Hindu Dharma. And so I pursued my bachelor's degree in religion. And what I found was something that was completely disconnected, and I would say the polar opposite of what I had learned at my home, at my Balvihar at Chinmaya Mission in the San Francisco Bay Area. And why was that the case? Because I was reading scholars, so-called scholars like Wendy Doniger. Back then, she was Wendy O'Flaherty. And so, I was fortunate enough to have a professor who was herself a practicing Hindu. And so when I would bring these disconnects to her, she said, well, you can't believe everything you read. And I was kind of confused because these are things that are supposed to be reviewed by peers and other academics. How could something so off be put into print? And, this was just a singular experience for me and for some of my classmates. And then fast forward to the days of the internet, because I'm talking about pre-internet even. I mean, maybe the internet was around, but the public didn't necessarily have access to it. And then all of a sudden, this platform called Sulekha comes. And there is a series of articles called Wendy's Children. And I remember reading the article and feeling both heard and seen because, again, I was part of a smaller cohort that was actually in the liberal arts, while all of my other Indian American peers were in kind of the hard sciences or in the business school. So they weren't seeing this. And so knowing that my experience was not just something in my head, but there was someone else, an adult in the room, so to speak, who was calling this stuff out was just really validating at that young age. And so that was probably my first introduction to Rajiv Malhotra. I think that, in our early days at HAF, I remember, let's just take something as simple as the Aryan invasion theory. And that is something that school textbooks across the United States still taught as good scholarship. And I remember oftentimes when we would go into the community to build awareness around this issue, we were dealing with a community that was coming out of India, largely out of English medium schools. And so they had been taught the same thing. So for these parents, basically, the reaction we would get was, well, so what? That's what we learned, right? And so that is kind of in the early 2000s. We don't hear that anymore. And I think that that's largely due to the awareness around the politics of the humanities. And Rajiv's books have been a real important part of that awareness building. And now we oftentimes get people who are activated who have read, say, Invading the Sacred or The Battle for Sanskrit or Indra's Net, and they want to do something now. Now, all of a sudden, they've been awakened to all of these different ecosystems and ideologies that have kept our civilization from tapping into our history, into our identity, in the way that we talk about ourselves and who we are has been constricted by a Western or Abrahamic framework. And all of a sudden you become aware of that. And so many I hear who may have just been living their lives, I very affectionately call this segment of people chai pakora types, where they're enjoying their chai, enjoying their pakora, and all of a sudden someone says, hey, read this book, and they become aware of some of the challenges that are so deep. They are rooted in colonial history. They're rooted in the earliest days of the formation of the nation state of India's government, and they become aware of how some of these powers are still at play, but just under the radar. And once they become aware of that, they want to take action. And so, in some sense, it kind of becomes the entry point, anyone who's read any of Rajiv's books, to wanting to become activists, which of course is great for the Hindu American Foundation. Like I said, a lot of his books impact so many people around the world, and they become aware of the challenges that we face as a civilization. And so there is a synergy there because we are at the Hindu American Foundation advocating for better narratives about Hindu civilization, of Indian history in school textbooks. And so if you don't have people who are aware that there is a rot, then you can't get them to take action. And so many of the things that we work on require warm bodies on the ground who are willing to show up for public testimony, who are willing to even take actions as, feeling as insignificant as putting their name and address into an action alert and hitting send. You would be surprised at sometimes the passivity that we come up against in our community. And so I think that there is that synergy as a result, that when people are introduced to these ideas, they are immediately inspired to wanting to do things. I think the other work beyond Rajiv's books that I think is important to mention is the type of funding that Infinity Foundation did in its early days of scholars. And, no one person or one entity can address the challenges that we face as a civilization and the story of our civilization. So identifying those scholars who are really committed to reading about Sanatan Dharma, about reading the original texts and not bringing in their own slants or their political ideologies or their political aims into the scholarship that they're producing, was a really important step in building out a broader ecosystem. So I know that many of the scholars that we work to even today are some of the early recipients of Infinity Foundation grants. And so that's another way where, Infinity Foundation and Rajiv have made their mark in the space of this civilizational battle, so to speak. We wish Infinity Foundation and Rajiv the very best. Thank you for your seva to Sanatan Dharma, and we look forward to finding ways to work together and to continue this good fight.